بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على خير المرسلين وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم سبحانك اللهم لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم. So welcome back. Some of you have been away for a while, some of you have been regulars, but we've been moving along quite nicely. We are probably about halfway through the second volume of the Risalah, so probably almost 3/4 of the way through now. We've gone through most of the things relating to buying and selling. And the last couple of weeks, we've been dealing with a topic that really is not implemented in the modern era, given the circumstances of the modern era, which is slavery and the freeing of slaves, the various different ways in which slaves are free. I think we finished last time with talking about slaves who are freed when they are abused physically and marks or disfigured and marks are left upon them, and slaves that are free when a person discovers that that slave is closely related to himself, which occasionally happened, I suppose, when somebody being brought up by someone, and then there was a war or something, or someone's become Muslim, and then their brother is captured or whatever it might be. So I mean, all of those circumstances that came into it. And today we're going to go to another very important topic, which is when it is obligatory to free slaves. So all up to now, it has been recommended, something that is a thing that brings you closer to Allah, as the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, whoever frees a slave, for every udwu, every limb of that slave, one of his own limbs is freed from the fire. So it's a massive thing, freeing slaves. But that was when you're doing it because it is a recommendation and a way of getting closer to Allah. But there are certain circumstances where you have to do it. And that is where you do something which requires a kafara, which is an expiation. For example, when you deliberately engage in intercourse or deliberately eat in the month of Ramadan, knowing that the month of Ramadan is upon you, then you have to pay expiation. Now, with Ramadan, obviously, you have a choice. You can choose whether you feed people or whether you fast 60 consecutive days or you free a slave. But in some of them, freeing a slave is the first one that you have to do, like vihar, for example. So freeing a slave, when you have to do it, this slave that you free has to meet certain characteristics, has to fulfill certain things. And that's the section that he's going to now. When you have to free a slave, it's not just any slave that you can free. This slave has to meet certain requirements in order for it to fulfill. Although sometimes if you free a slave that hasn't fulfilled these things, that slave is free as well. But you still have to do your kafara because you haven't met your kafara. So if you get it wrong, you just end up freeing more. So in that particular aspect. But he says here, ولا يعتق في الرقاب الواجبة من فيه معنى من عتق بتدبير أو كتابة أو غيرهما. So the first condition of a slave that you free, when you have to free a slave, such as, for example, also when you make an oath by Allah that if you do not do something, you have to free a slave. That's another one of the ways it was done. The first thing is this slave must be completely a slave. It cannot be on the way to being freed already. And we mentioned some of the ways that happen. For example, if you make an agreement with the slave that the slave will pay in installments to achieve his freedom, that's called a mukatab, and you would not be allowed to free a mukatab when you are obliged to free a slave. Another one is a mudabbar, when you say to the slave, you'll be free upon my death. You cannot then say to that slave when you are required to free a slave, okay, I'm freeing you, because he's already on the way to freedom. This would also be an walad. So a female slave that's born you a child, you would not be allowed to say to her when you are required to free a slave, okay, I'm freeing you now, because she's definitely going to be free upon your death. And already you're not allowed to treat her fully as a slave anymore anyway. So that's the first condition, that the slave must be a complete slave, fully a slave, fully owned. ولا أعمى ولا أقطع اليد وشبيهه. And the second part of this is the slave must have no physical ailments. It cannot be naqis, it cannot be deficient in any physical way. It can't be, the slave is not allowed to be a blind slave, because obviously you're trying to get rid of a slave that's of less use to yourself, or a slave that's lost an arm, or a slave that is old and sick and no longer able to work, or anything like that. Yes, it's recommended for you to free slaves of all sorts. Doesn't matter which type. I mean, this particular slave who's blind may be a wonderful person who would be a fantastic asset to society as a free person. But for the purpose of fulfilling the obligation of freeing a slave, you have to choose a slave that has a higher, that basically has a proper value, that's not been devalued because of something that's happened to it, because it's a financial thing as well as an act of worship. So you have to make sure that it's not physically handicapped. The slave is not physically handicapped in any way. وَلَا مَنْ عَلَى غَيْرِ الْإِسْلَامِ, nor are you allowed to free a non-Muslim slave. The slave has to be Muslim if the slave is one that you are obliged to free in order to fulfill a kafara or fulfill an oath. This doesn't mean it's not allowed to free non-Muslim slaves. Of course it is, but that's part of the recommendation of generally of freeing slaves, but not when it's an obligation. This is a general rule with most of these things, like for feeding as well. When something is an obligation on you to feed, it's always Muslim poor that are emphasized, not the poor in general, such as the feeding of the people in Ramadan. So when something is an act of worship or an act of pleasing Allah, the implication is that the person who is the beneficiary is also a Muslim, as well as yourself. وَلَا مَنْ عَلَى غَيْرِ الْإِسْلَامِ وَلَا يَجُوزُ عِتْقُ الصَّبِيِّ وَلَا الْمُولَى عَلَيْهِ. Finally, the slave that is freed must be an adult slave, a slave that has reached puberty. Cannot be a child, cannot be a slave that, needs a wali for any other reason. For example, the slave might be what's called safih, might be an adult, but the slave is what's called safih. In other words, has no ability to financially look after himself or herself. If you give that slave money, they fritter it away, and nothing useful comes out of it. If you leave them in society, they will basically become dependent immediately, straight away. There are lots of people like that in society. But we live in an age where more people are Rashid than many other times in the past. This applies especially to women. A lot of young women are now Rashida in the sense that they have the ability to financially support themselves because of the way it's the way it's all to do with people having jobs, and they are capable now of having jobs because of the way the world is structured. I mean, but also at the same time, they have to be also capable of spending their money in the way that does not leave them after 2 days of getting their paycheck having to go around and ask people for help. But I mean, with the slave that you free has to be Rashid, cannot be mad, cannot be any of the other reasons that causes a slave to require the slave to have somebody looking after him, a government. What's the word in English? Guardian, yeah, guardian. Also, the implication of that is, of course, the slave has to be mentally sound, because you can't be capable in society unless you are mentally sound. So you couldn't free a mad slave who was undergoing bouts of madness. So that's with regard to the slaves that are freed when you have to free a slave. Next, he moves on to a concept which is called wala. Wala. And basically, wala is the right to inherit from a slave. If you look in classical books, you often see the people who became Muslim in the north, the tribes, they were called the Mawali, because they were what's called Mawla, because they had been given the gift of Islam from the Muslims who brought them into Islam. So when they first became Muslim, they were called Mawla. But this word is more often used with slaves that have been freed. So Mawla, if you see this word, sometimes means the person who frees a slave, or the patron of a slave. and sometimes it means the freed slave, the freed man or the freed woman. The word is used for both of them. And when you free a slave, if you are the one who frees that slave, whether it's your own slave or you buy somebody else's slave and free that slave, then you have the wala of that slave. What this means is if the slave then dies without any heirs, you are the asib, the final inheritor of that slave, and you inherit whatever that ex-slave leaves behind. So even though he's no longer a slave, if he dies intestate and without anybody to inherit from him, you take what he leaves. So this is a connection, and it passes down from generation to generation. So the freedman's children, the same would apply to them. If they then died without any heirs, it would go back to whoever is the mawla on the other side, and then that would pass down to the, as we're going to come to the male children, and then to the next level of male children, and so on and so on and so on. It doesn't pass through just one line. So if a man frees a slave, then that man dies and he has 2 sons. These 2 sons inherit the wala from him. If one of those sons dies, leaving his own sons, those sons do not get any part of this wala yet, because they're still their uncle alive. If their uncle then dies, then it passes to whichever is in the next generation of sons. And all it means is this wala is that they have the capacity to inherit from this freedman. Sometimes people would free a slave in order to get the wala, to bring some benefit to themselves, because they could see that this slave was very, very capable. And if they freed him, they would suddenly, he didn't look like he was going to get any family. You would suddenly have access to this tremendous inheritance you could get further down the line. Because it would be an encouragement to that slave then to really branch out in terms of his earning, because it's now all his and he's not working as a slave anymore. And so you would think, okay, well, if I do this, there's a good financial reward in it for me further down the line. So that comes into it because you're not allowed in certain circumstances to bring benefit by yourself by certain things. So that comes into it. They take that into account when somebody's giving testimony. If somebody gives testimony, one of the heirs, my father freed that slave, because they know that slave is going to bring in a tremendous wala, then, and all of the other heirs are female besides him, and so the wala will go to him, then there's some suspicion being attached to why he's giving this testimony. Because instead of this slave then being owned by all of the heirs, according to their shares, suddenly he's the only one who has the right of inheritance from that ex-slave. So, these things were sometimes used, and they have to be taken into account when you look into testimony and whether the strength of testimony, whether somebody's testimony is accepted or not, and so on and so on. He says, well, wala, this thing called wala belongs to liman a'taq, the one who frees the slave, whether that person is male or female or whoever frees the slave, the wala is theirs. So this is the only time where a female can be what's called an asib. Because generally speaking, when you look at the rules of inheritance, females are given a certain share of the inheritance when they are connected, like daughters and sisters and so on. But if somebody dies and leaves only distant relatives, even if a female is closer than a male, that female is not going to inherit. It's going to go to the male asib. I mean, one of the reasons for this is because males were the breadwinners and were required. And when a woman gets married, her husband is required to financially support her. So she doesn't have as many financial requirements. Obviously, some of those things have changed in the modern world, but that does not mean that the situation that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commanded is wrong. It means that the modern world has sort of become a bit warped in the way that it views priorities. But anyway, so this is one of the times when a female is the last inheritor. So if a female frees a slave, and then that slave amasses a fortune, or that ex-slave amasses a fortune, and then that ex-slave dies without leaving any heirs who take all of his wealth, or he leaves only daughters, so 2/3 of his wealth is inherited by his daughters, and that leaves a third left, and he has nobody else to inherit. This female inherits everything that's left because she freed that slave. وَلَا يَجُوزُ بَيْعُهُ وَلَا هِبَتُهُ. You're not allowed to sell wala. So this right of wala is not something that somebody can see, that it's a good bet. That ex-slave is likely to amass a fortune. So you can say to somebody, look, I've got the right of wala now. If you want to buy it off me, you have a chance of making yourself a fortune at some point in the past, because this guy he's a clever merchant, this chap. No, you're not allowed to do that.
What is the difference between selling wala and selling a slave?
Well, you're selling a slave is you're transferring the property of that slave from one person to another. So his service now belongs to somebody else. A wala is nothing to do with the slave. Wala is to do with the slave who's already being freed, is the right to inherit from that slave.
Inherit.
So you're not allowed to sell inheritance either. For example, if I, have a right to inherit half of my father's estate and I want some money now, I can't go to some chap and say, look, my father's quite a rich guy. He's only left 2 sons and I'm one of them. So, I'm going to inherit some serious amount when he kicks the bucket. But I need some money now. Do you want to buy my share so you can have my share of the inheritance? Would that be permitted? No, because you're not allowed to sell inheritance or a share of inheritance. In the same way, wala is like inheritance. You're not allowed to sell it. You're not allowed to give it away. I couldn't, if I'm a son and, somebody else comes along, for example, my father adopted some other fellow or raised somebody else alongside us who wasn't actually related to my dad. I can't say to him, I forego my share of the inheritance and give it to him. I'm not allowed to do that either. Yes, after the parent dies, then I can do whatever I want with the money that I have inherited. But I can't give that right to somebody else, because it's a right that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given in the Quran to somebody who has a certain connection to the deceased. And that can't be transferred. It would open all sorts of doors to all sorts of corruption. Because as soon as you allow it to be given, you allow it to be bought and sold. This brings in all sorts of gharar transactions. And then what if somebody pays you like $1 million for your share of the inheritance because your dad has 10 million, and then all of your dad's ships sink at sea and he dies having nothing? It's basically a gamble, isn't it?
But you could sell slave to a slave and say you have no family in your account. But you could sell a slave to someone and say you have no family. Wink, wink.
Well, you can do anything with property. You can give it away, you can sell it, all of these types of things.
You say, oh, you have no family.
That doesn't make any difference. So, it's actually better for a slave when you buy a slave that the slave doesn't have family, because he can give more time to you rather than to his family. So it would make a slave more valuable.
Possible inheritance.
Yeah, but you're not inheriting from a slave. You're inheriting from a freed slave.
But you're implying that you need to free the slave.
Yeah.
I think he's trying to say that's part of the selling the slave, but I don't think
The selling the slave is a totally different transaction. This is a transaction related to what happens after you have freed a slave.
Can you attach that simplification?
You can free the slave on behalf of somebody else. Instead of selling the slave or giving the slave to someone, you can say, look, I'm freeing the slave in the name of or on behalf of so and so. Then yes, that's different, because then the wala goes to that chap now. But once you have this right of inheritance, you cannot simply transfer it to somebody else. That's not allowed. وَمَنْ أَعْتَقَ عَبْدًا عَنْ رَجُلٍ فَالْوَلَى لِلرَّجُلِ. So he says, if you free a slave on behalf of somebody else, then that other person has the wala, not you. So it's not the actual physical act of saying to the slave you're free, it's who you're doing it on behalf of. There was also, as you're going to come to in a second, there was another way of doing it, which is when you free a slave on behalf of the Muslims as a whole. In which case, nobody specific then gets the wala. If the person dies, it goes to the Bayt al-Mal. his estate if he leaves no one. ولا يكون الولاء لمن أسلم على يديه وهو للمسلمين. So this is another one that there were a few scholars who said that if you go out and you do da'wah to someone and that person enters Islam through your efforts at your hand, that this wala that we're talking about for a freed slave also applies to that new Muslim. So if, for example, I did da'wah to somebody and then he became Muslim on my hand and then he died and none of the other people around him became Muslim, none of the non-Muslims can inherit from him. So who then inherits the estate of that Muslim who became a Muslim at your hand? There were some, very few, who said that you, the person at whose hand he became Muslim, are now his heir. And you inherit because you have done wala ni'mah, you have done a service for him by calling him to Islam and bringing him into Islam. And so you have wala in the same way as you do a ni'mah, a service to a slave when you free that slave. But this is not the position of Imam Malik or the position of the majority of the Muslims. He says when that happens, if a new Muslim dies and he does not have any heirs, then the Muslims as a whole inherit from him. In other words, his estate goes to the Bayt al-Mal. This is the accepted position here. Because this happened a lot in the past. Because the basic thing when it comes to inheritance is a Muslim cannot inherit from a non-Muslim and a non-Muslim cannot inherit from a Muslim. It's a very basic principle. So when somebody becomes Muslim, the majority of their family tend to be non-Muslim. So who then inherits if this guy becomes Muslim and then dies soon after? Maybe this guy becomes Muslim and then goes and fights jihad and dies. Who inherits from him? This is obviously something that happened a lot, especially when Islam was expanding very, very quickly in the early times. And you also had another situation where a group of people would come and they'd say, we are becoming Muslim together. And then they would say, and yes, this man here, he is my brother. And they would become Muslim together, claiming that they were related to each other. Their word was not accepted on that, because it would open the door to too many situations where people would come and claim a relationship to us purely based because they were countrymen, claim they have some family relationship, and then that would deny money that in fact now belongs to the Muslims from going to the Muslims. So in those situations, the only time their word would be accepted is if they were Muslims who could testify on their behalf. Say they came from a country where there were Muslim prisoners, or Muslims had seen them before and knew that they were related, then they could testify on their behalf. But otherwise, in those sorts of situations, their word alone is not accepted. But when the Muslims went to a city and they conquered a city and the people of that city became Muslim, then the word of the people there is accepted, because there's already can be seen the family relationships going on in that place. So it depended in these situations about whether the people were coming to the Muslims or whether the Muslims were going to the people. But that's a side point. وَوَلَاءُ مَا عَتَقَتِ الْمَرْأَةُ لَهَا. If a woman frees a slave, she gets the wala of that freedman. وَوَلَاءُ مَنْ يُجَرُّ مِنْ وَلَدٍ أَوْ عَبْدٍ أَعْتَقَتْهُ. And she also gets the wala of any children that slave that she freed has. So she doesn't only get the wala of the slave that she frees, but if that man then goes off and has children, and then his children die without any heirs, she can inherit from those children. And if that slave, who was a slave, that freed man now, has his own slaves and frees those slaves, that direct connection of wala between that mawla and his now freed slaves goes to her if there's nobody else to inherit. So it can be chains. But this, when you say that women with a woman, she has to have a direct connection to the wala, it can continue like that. But she cannot inherit a wala from her father. So that's the difference between a male and a female. She can get the wala of her freedman, the wala of her freedman's children, the wala of her freedman's freedmen. But her daughter cannot get the wala from her. Or if her father had freed somebody, she couldn't get the wala from her father. وَلَا تَرِثُ مَا أَعْتَقَ غَيْرُهَا. So she cannot inherit what the wala of slaves that have been freed by somebody else, even if she is the heir of that person, like the daughter. Min abin or ibnin. So whether that person who freed the slave was her father or her son, or zawj, or her husband, or anyone else. So that's just a general principle. I mean, we're not really in a situation where we really have to worry much about this form of wala. The wala of people becoming Muslim, yes, that is something that's quite common in the modern era. But the position of Malik, as I said, is there is no direct taking of wala by a single person. It simply belongs to the Muslims as a whole. In much the same way as any Muslim person who has family, but then all of his family die before him and then he dies, his money does not go to anybody he puts in a will. So, for example, if a Muslim man who's let's say a Muslim man is a millionaire and he has no family, and then he dies, and he writes in his will that he wants all of this money to go to such and such a person, Ahmed or whatever. Yeah? What do we do? No. Only a third of it can go to Ahmed. The rest of it goes to the Bayt al-Mal of the Muslims. This is one of the things that I think in every society, even when we don't live in a so-called Muslim society, wherever we have communities, we should try and have some sort of Bayt al-Mal. Because there's always going to be, or treasury, because there's always going to be people in any community who die who have nobody to inherit from them. So we don't want to be having a situation where money is going to people where it shouldn't be going. We want to have it as correct as we can possibly make it.
How does Ahmed still be able to inherit if he's Muslim?
Because the man who died was Muslim.
Oh.
I said a Muslim man who's a very rich man dies, and he writes in a will, he has no heirs, but he writes in his will that he wants it all to go to Ahmed. What happens in that situation is a third of his wealth goes to Ahmed, because he's only allowed to write a will relating to a third of his wealth. Then what happens with the remaining 2/3 of his wealth? That's the thing that we do. There are issues sometimes where you have to go outside of the madhab. I mean, for example, there was a situation where a person dies and leaves only a wife and no one else. No children, has never had children, they never had children, leaves only a wife. What happens in that situation? Well, the wife inherits a quarter, but then what about the rest of his money? Because the wife is not an asiba. She's not somebody who gets what remains after all the heirs have taken their... So what we do in this situation, when there's only one heir, is you go outside the madhab, because there are positions outside the madhab where a single heir, regardless of whether that heir is male or female, can inherit everything. And so but basically the position that you take in this situation is it goes to the Bayt al-Mal, but you have circumstances where you don't have a Bayt al-Mal, a treasury. So what do you do then? You have to give it all to that person by stepping outside of the madhab, basically. وَمِيرَاثُ السَّائِبَةِ لِجَمَاعَةِ الْمُسْلِمِينَ. So this is a sa'iba, literally is a word that was used to describe free grazing cattle. So this is one of the ways that slaves would be free. They would free them as a sa'iba. In other words, you're free to go where you want without specifying. That means you're freeing them on behalf of everybody, and you don't want anything, not even the wala, after you've freed them. So when somebody frees somebody in that way, in that particular wording, basically, you're free to go where you want, and I want nothing, or however you're going to voice it. Then if that person dies, their estate goes to the Muslims as a whole, not to the person who freed them, because he's basically washed his hands or relinquished his right to any wala that he would otherwise. So it's something that in the moment of freeing, a person can relinquish their right to. But generally speaking, the default when somebody frees a slave is that the wala, the right of inheritance, goes to that person when the freed person dies without leaving heirs. والولاء للعقد من عصبة الميت الأول. So here he says basically that when a person dies, having freed a slave, and leaves family behind, it goes to the most closely related to him. So if he dies and leaves children, the male, it goes to his male children. If he dies and the closest are grandchildren, grandsons, it goes to the grandsons. If he dies and the closest is his father, it goes to his father. If he dies and the closest relative left after him is his brother, it goes to his brother. Yep, and then if his brother has children, it would pass down that way. So this is that's the way you have to work. It's similar to the right of asaba, of inheriting as an asif, that what remains of an inheritance. In the same way as that, the right of taking the wala and having that connection to the freed person transfers to the closest relative if the person who freed the slave is no longer with us. فإن ترك ابنين فورث ولاء مولا لأبيه ثم مات أحدهما وترك بنين رجع الولاء إلى أخيه دون بنيه. So he says here, if two brothers inherit the wala, the right of inheritance of a freed person, so that when two brothers inherit it, obviously, if that freed man dies without any heirs and leaves 1,000 dinars, they would each get 500 dinars because they're sharing the wala.
So if that slave, the ex-slave dies but has an heir,
Yeah.
is that
Yeah, that cuts off the right of the
son?
It doesn't remove the wala, it just stops him from inheriting.
The sons,
the person who freed him keeps his wala, because that wala will then go to will apply now to the son. So if the freed man has a son,
if that son spends all the money,
it's not nothing to do with the money. Wala is not to do with the money itself. Wala is to do with the right upon his death of inheriting from him. So if you free a slave and that slave then has a child and then dies and the child inherits all of that ex-slave's money, the wala now is still with you, but it's no longer connected to the person you freed, but now to his son.
that wala stay with, so that wala will stay with the sons as well.
Yeah, and we'll keep on staying with it until somebody dies without any
generation that go on for
infinitum, which is why they were called whole tribes, pliant tribes in a sense. But I mean, but you have to be able to prove it as well. I mean, that's the problem, you can claim this, but it's very, very difficult to prove.
If you got any relatives or like a son or something, he cannot block that.
Yeah, that son blocks, even if he has, an uncle or a great uncle or anything, and that person is a Muslim, obviously, then it blocks him. But I mean, it was when people were involved in wars and things like that, there were often cases where people died without anyone, or nobody knew of their heirs. Often when you talk about testifying about somebody being the heir of somebody, it's not enough to say, I testify that he's so-and-so's son. If you want him to inherit the guy's house, you have to say, and I testify that I don't know of any other heirs but him. By the way, it's funny, they talk about this. If you testify that there are definitely no heirs but him, and you are not somebody who would be likely to know that, not having been related, then that's considered to be shahadat zur, because you're testifying to something definite when you have no way of knowing that to be the case.
And if the former slave owner dies, the wala passes in.
Yeah, that's the whole point. If the person who freed the slave dies, and he has relatives, obviously if he doesn't have any relatives at all, then the whole thing disappears. But it's very unusual for somebody to not have any relatives. So if he dies, then it goes to the nearest male relatives. And the nearest male relatives, actually, the son, grandson, great-grandson, great-great-grandson, all take precedence before anybody. Then it would go to the father. Then it would go to brothers and sons of brothers, then grandfather. But I mean, you have to, there's a whole order to, you have to know who is the aqad, which literally means the most seated. Well, yeah, people, that's why it's very, very important to keep a careful track. That's why zina is such a terrible thing. It makes it incredibly difficult in a society to know the real relationships between people, because it affects money, the distribution of money and money wealth. And as soon as you have problems working out where money goes, that's when a lot of fitna happens. So societies get ripped apart purely because they don't know who the heir is. Then he says here, so you have two sons. A man frees a slave, then he has two sons, and those slaves inherit the wala of the freed man of their father. Then one of these two sons dies, leaving sons of his own. So you have the man who freed the slave, then he has two sons. Then these two, and he freed he has the wala of this freed slave. Then one of these two sons dies. So now you have grandsons on one side and you have the son on the other. Do these grandsons inherit the half of the wala of their father? That's the question here. Or does it go back to the surviving brother? Yeah. So here he says here, in this situation, the wala goes back to the surviving brother, and the children of the brother who died do not have any part of it. He says here, وَإِن مَاتَ واحد وترك ولدا ومات أخوه. He says, if one of these brothers dies and then the other leaving sons, and then his brother dies, and that brother has no sons of his own, this brother that was on his own, that had the full wala when his brother died, now he's died. So what happens to this full wala? He's got no children of his own. Where does it go? It goes not to his own grandsons, but his nephews, because they are the closest to the person who freed him. So it's not like inheritance where it would now go to his children. It goes to the closest. If both brothers died and both brothers had sons, then it will be split between all of them on the same level. So it can get very divided and very complicated. Say people had very big families. Say somebody had 10 sons, and this was divided between them. And and then this person, the freedman, had children of his own, and children of his own. You can get really, really diffused here. So I suppose you have to have very good record keepers in order to work out. And you could have 10 sons. They've all died, and they've all left 10 sons of their own. Now you have 100 all on the same level who are inheriting this this wala of the other family. وَتَرَكَ وَلَدَيْنِ فَالْوَلَا بَيْنَ. So he says here, وَإِن مَاتَ وَاحِدٌ. If one of these two brothers dies, وَتَرَكَ وَلَدًا, and leaves one son of his own, وَمَاتَ أَخُوهُ, and then his brother dies, the one to whom the wala had returned, وَتَرَكَ وَلَدَيْنِ, and his brother had left two sons of his own. You now have 3 sons. He says, 2 belonging to one of the sons, 2 grandsons that were from one of the sons, and 1 grandson from the other son. He says, فَالْوَلَاءُ بَيْنَ الثَّلَاثَ أَثْلَاثًا. The wala is divided between the 3, with each of them getting a third. But wala is not money. Wala is simply a right to inherit should a certain set of circumstances take place. That's all it is. So that's the end of the section relating to slavery. Are there any questions on any of that?
You said something about wala if somebody is down and somebody became Muslim.
Yeah, that's called the wala al-Islam, and that basically they often call the new Muslims mawlas, but it's not to be confused, according to Malik, with a mawla who is a freed slave, even though some thought that they had the same status. Basically, it was because people became Muslim and they had this connection now with the Muslims, and they had no heirs very often when they became Muslims.
So it had nothing to do with the slave. This is a free man. He became Muslim.
A free man became Muslim.
So how can somebody claim that it was them that gave them the dawah to become Muslim?
Well, I mean, it's not necessarily just the dawah. It's the person at whose hands he takes his
Okay.
shahada, basically. I mean, it's difficult to quantify exactly which word was the one that resulted in that guy saying, all right, yeah, you know, that guy said some nice stuff, but this word, man, that's done it. I'm becoming Muslim because of that. I mean, you've got to be careful with, if you take that position, then, you know, a lot of people would then start doing dawah, hoping, my gosh, I can make a fortune out of this. Yeah. MashaAllah.
It's really interesting to just to think about how they appreciated the friendship between the slave and its owner, and how after being they created something called wala, which the owner of the slave, he doesn't have any son, or he will be the inheritance as well.
Because he's almost like a father. I mean, the word they use, I think, in English for some of these situations is like patron. And a patron comes from paterna, which is father. So that it is a sort of relationship, like, you know, a father, his relationship in this world, Allah creates everyone, but his relationship in this world is to bring that, to help bring that person into this life. So he has a connection to him. When you free a slave, you have given them a new life, in a sense, some new aspect of life that they didn't have before. And when you bring somebody into Islam, you have changed their life. You have given them something that they didn't have before. So all of these are sorts of relationships between somebody who is a mun'im giving something to somebody who's mun'am. This is the basic relationship here. And, you know, most relationships are to do with giving and receiving. Whatever form they take, even with blood, very often. So we have now a new section, Bab fi shuf'a wal hiba wal sadaqa wal hubus wal rahn wal ariya wal wadi'a wal luqta or luqata wal ghasb. So all of these things are covered in this one chapter. He starts with shuf'a, which, as I said, is often translated as preemption, but it's the right of, he's going to go into it in more detail, but basically it's the right of a partner who owns something with somebody else in common. In other words, it hasn't been subdivided yet, to, if his partner sells it, to claim it back and buy it back, basically. That's shuf'a. Hiba, there's two types of hiba, but there's two words here, hiba and sadaqah. Now everybody knows sadaqah. Sadaqah is when you give something, usually to the poor, for the face of Allah. So your purpose in doing it is that you increase in nearness to Allah. You are trying to do something that Allah loves. A hiba is slightly different. You're doing it because of your love for that person and you want to enrich them or help them out. For example, silatul rahim. When you're doing something because of your family connection with somebody, you are doing it because of that, who that person is, in order for the sake of that person, not specifically for the sake of Allah. Your aim is for that person. You're doing it because of your love for that person or your desire to see that person do well. So that's a gift, whereas sadaqah is for the sake of Allah. Sometimes they can crisscross, because I mean, obviously, most of us, when we give, even to somebody we love, will hope that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will accept it from us. But the underlying intention behind it is what differentiates the one from the other. Sadaqah is purely for whoever you are for the sake of Allah, and hiba is for that person specifically.
Can you make any I'm going to treat this as a salad.
Yeah, of course, you can give sadaqah to your family because your intention is doing something for the sake of Allah more than anything else. But if you're doing it because of a family connection, I mean, we often give somebody, like a birthday gift or whatever it is. That's not necessarily for your primary intention being for the sake of Allah, although you might want Allah to accept it. But your primary intention is because of that person's special day. You want to honor that person.
That's superior.
Well, generally, yeah. Generally, because it's for the sake of Allah. There, and as we're going to come to, there are different things with relation to taking it back. In certain circumstances where it's permitted with the one and not permitted with the other. And also with sadaqah, as we're going to come to, if I give something away as sadaqah, say a horse to somebody, fi sabilillah sadaqah, and then that horse appears in the market for sale, I'm not allowed to buy back that horse because you can't. But if it was a gift I gave somebody and I find it for sale in the market, then I can buy it back. So there's a slight difference because you're not meant to. Because the reason you gave that horse as well as you wanted to please Allah by having it leave your possession. So if you then just bring it straight back into your possession, it sort of goes against the.
That is so clever. It makes sense why this stuff exists. They can't play these games.
Yeah. There's lots of games. The next one is called hubus, which is also known as a waqf, which is giving the usage or the fruit or produce of something away to a particular for somebody for a particular purpose or for a particular person, but not giving away the actual thing itself. So basically that, if you give away something, then that becomes the property of that person and that person can then sell it and do other things with it. If you give away simply the use of that thing or any benefit that arises from that, then that person can never sell it. But the use remains for that person and anybody else who follows on from that person ad infinitum. So actually there's a lot more benefit sometimes in giving away the use of something than actually giving away the thing itself. Because when you give away the thing itself, it can be gone within one generation or 1 year or any length of time.
So if you set up a waqf, do you still own it?
Yes.
You own the waqf?
You do, but it's an ownership in name only. I mean, and the reason, but there is a benefit to it. For example, if I set up a waqf for everybody called, think of a Omar, yeah, and then we arrive at a time when there's no one anywhere to be found with the name Omar. There's no Omars anywhere. We search. What happens now with what is being produced by this waqf? Who does it go to? It goes to the closest relatives of the founder of the waqf, who are in need. So that indicates that they are still the owner, because no, it doesn't. It never goes back to him. Never goes back to him. But it does indicate some level of degree of ownership. But also, according to Malik, when it comes to a waqf, as we're going to come to, it can be temporary in terms of it doesn't have to be forever. So generally speaking, if I create a waqf and I don't say any timeline for that waqf, the default position is that it's forever. But with Malik, you're allowed to say, I am making this house into a waqf for the poor for the next 10 years. And at the end of those 10 years, it reverts back to me. That's fine. So again, that's a proof that it doesn't leave your ownership. Hubus, they're exactly the same thing. Mutaradif, they are synonyms for each other. Yeah, they are exactly the same thing. And the other thing you have to be, we're going to go into hubus in more detail when we get to it, but the other thing with the hubus is you cannot go against the intention of the person who created it. He basically writes the stipulation of what it's going to be used for, the purpose of it, and no one has a right to go against that purpose. So you can't have like a ministry of awqaf suddenly saying, well, I know this was meant to be for people studying the fiqh of Malik, but I think it's better put for the poor of this area. They're not allowed to do that. They have to follow the prescription of the person who created the waqf. You can't simply come along and say, well, actually, this one is more deserving now. So that's the problem with having all of these ministries of awqaf, is that they suddenly, everything becomes like the same thing. all of the money collected, then it goes into a pot and they use it for whatever they want to use it for, which goes against the basic principle of awqaf. They're not meant to be government run. As we do have an issue though in the modern era where the people who created the waqf have died out, and people no longer are aware of what the purpose of the waqf originally was. Those are the situations where you could make a case for an authority to step in. But what they should do, rather than taking it under one big umbrella, is they should appoint a new person to run it and keep it separate and independent, rather than having everything under a single umbrella, where it becomes very, very difficult to separate each individual purpose from. Then he says, warrahan, and rahan is pawning or pledging something. When you, for example, if I borrow £1,000 from you, I might give you my bike as a rahan. You pawn it, so you look after it, and then in the event that I'm unable to pay, then you can go to the qadi, and the qadi can say, well, you can sell that and recover some of what's owed to you, or yeah, absolutely. Sometimes the rahan could be worth more than the actual debt, but the person can never get more than was owed to him. We'll go back to the original owner. Well, ariya, an ariya is simply like a qard, a loan, but with things. So basically, an ariya is the use of something usually for a limited period of time. So if I have an axe, I say, here's my axe, return it to me next week. I've done an ariya. You have the use of this thing, it doesn't belong to you, but you have the use of it for that week. There are certain things with this, but you have to use it for the purpose that it's intended. If you use the axe as an impromptu axle in your car and then it breaks, then you're culpable. Well, wadi'ah, and wadi'ah is either depositing something with somebody, or leaving something with somebody for safekeeping, like an amana, basically. So you're traveling, you leave this thing with them for them to look after. That's a wadi'ah. Well, luqata, and that's found lost property. So when a person loses something, if you find it on the street, that's called luqata. Then there are certain rulings attached to that, which he's going to come to in this chapter. And ghasb. So ghasb is an important one, and it's usually something which is done by the strong to the weak. Basically, is when you take something that belongs to somebody else from them and make use of it as if it's your own. It's different from stealing, because stealing is taking something on the sly, basically. This is, you're stronger than them, so you go to them and say, I'm having that and I'm using it. It's like my own. Your car, it's my car now, I'm using it.
How's that different?
Because stealing is when you use deception and you secrecy to steal in and take something without people being aware. Whereas it's basically, it's overt. It's called usurpation is often.
Is that allowed?
No. but it's not considered the same ruling as saraqa, which is stealing, which has your hand cut off. This has different implications.
Heavier punishment.
It's not heavier punishment, no,
Nice.
because sariqa involves deception. I mean, this one involves dhulm and taking somebody else's property, but deception is quite a. But ghasb, you know, I think a lot of these forms of taxation are ghasb, because they are taking something from you, your hard-earned wealth, without, just because they're stronger than you and you can't say no.
What's the punishment for that?
There is no specific hudud for ghasb, but he'll come to it in due time. But
so when the Israeli says to the Palestinian, if I don't steal it, someone else will steal it, then very overt about his usurpation. So what's the pushback for that?
Well, you basically take it back to them. They are liable for everything that happens to it, and there will be some sort of tankeel or punishment to put off people. I mean, for example, with shahadat zur, which doesn't have a specific had punishment, the recommendation that it mentions in the Mudawwana is that the person who does this be whipped, and one of the things it says 40 times, which is quite a lot. Then they be paraded in front of the majalis of the Muslims. They be taken, like, for example, put on the back of a horse or put, and then sort of taken to all of the mosques and then pointed out, this guy is a guy who lies. Don't take a word from him. And sometimes they says they add the harf. In other words, he would be made to look a bit of a fool. His beard would be shaved off if it was a man. Hair might be cut off if it was a woman. They would be sat backwards on the horse. They'd look like a complete idiot, and they would be taken around. And he also mentioned sometimes in prison for a long time. I mean, that's not a had punishment, but it's quite a, yeah. I mean, and this is up to the Qadi, where basically the purpose of it is to put other people off doing the same thing.
The interesting thing about this is quickly from so minor football, playing football, didn't do the second one.
Yeah.
And it could be, it's go until it was very hard punishment, as the things you mentioned.
Yeah.
The judge.
Well, it's up to the judge, yeah. But Shahad Zur was considered to be a serious one, because when you do Shahada of testimony, you are taking somebody's right from them and giving it to somebody else when you lie. So it's a very, very serious crime. I mean, I think the Imam mentioned it in the khutbah today in one of the hadith that he mentioned. Very, very serious crime. So, I mean, some of these things have punishments. I mean, even when it comes to debts, a debtor can be thrown in prison for a long time before refusing to pay a debt. And I mean, it's not a fun punishment to be bunged, to be locked up and prevented from leaving a place. I mean, generally speaking, imprisonment was not one of the main ways that people were punished, but it was used in certain situations. So we'll finish there, because that was basically just an introduction to it, and then we're going to go into the first one, which is Shuf'ah, next time, inshallah. Shuf'ah was the first one that I mentioned, which was the partner's right to claim what has been sold by his partner without consulting him or asking him whether he wants to buy it. Any questions? Don't commit shahadat zur. We do need some qadis, and we do need witnesses. I mean, it's a very, very important thing to have witnesses for the contracts that we do, and then people who are capable of giving testimony when situations happen.
The things, for most of the people, they give shahadat zur. They ban from giving testimony forever. Yes. And nowadays it's so easy to ban someone, like it will be recorded.
Yeah.
They have given false testimony.
Yeah.
And despite the mention.
I mean, false testimony is one of the few ones where they're forbidden forever. I mean, there are other situations where a person's shahada is not allowed anymore. For example, if he's drinking alcohol and he's discovered to be doing that, or he's committing fornication, or any of the other sorts of acts that, or even that they mention a lot of the things that ill befit the manhood of a person. So, I mean, some of the madhabs have mentioned somebody being known not to play Salatul Witr. But if that person rectifies his ways, then he can be, his testimony can be accepted. But if somebody has committed false testimony, then his testimony can never again be accepted, no matter how much he seems to have become like the best acting person on the planet.
They call it the fiqh, and it's different from specific culture to another, specific society to another.
Yeah.
And sometimes could be a specific society, you need to play with it.
Yeah.
And sometimes regarding to the mark, if you do it the way you shave, the way you be considering some.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, in certain places, for sure. I mean, also he mentions if somebody is known to be a kadhab, if he's known to be somebody who frequently tells lies in more than just one thing. So if he just tells lies about one thing, then his testimony can still be accepted, because he's only lying and say, "Oh, I caught a fish the size of an elephant or whatever, if he just lies about his fishing, then, you know, his testimony might still be acceptable. But if somebody is, you know, frequently lies about lots of things, then again, he's somebody whose testimony is not allowed. But again, he can rectify his ways. But if somebody has given false testimony before a qadi, he can never rectify it. Anyway, we'll finish there inshallah. Bismillah barakatuh, bismillahir rahmanir rahim. Alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen, ar-rahmanir rahim, maliki yawmiddin, iyyaka na'budu wa iyyaka nasta'in, ihdinas siratal mustaqim, siratal ladhina an'amta alayhim, ghayril maghdubi alayhim waladdallin. Amin. Allahumma salli ala sayyidina Muhammadin abdika wa rasulika an-nabiyyi wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallim taslima. Subhana rabbika rabbil izzati ma yasifun wa salamun al mursalin walhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. Assalamu alaikum. See you.